Hey everyone, welcome to a bonus edition of the Apod. Normally this drops every single Wednesday, msgnetworks.com, iTunes, Google Play, but it's Friday and we're giving you another episode because that's what we do. We like to go above and beyond for our loyal listeners, and thank you so much for listening to this podcast. Thank you for subscribing. Thank you for rating, leaving a review. It helps others find the podcast just like you have. This is a budding, growing podcast, and we hope that more people like you will find it and enjoy it. So thank you for contributing to the cause. It's Friday, not Wednesday, and we have a bonus podcast. Rick Carpiniello is our guest. He has covered the New York Rangers for almost 40 years. He has a lot of war stories covering the team, and he also has a lot of fun stories from behind the scenes. So it was a lot of fun talking to somebody who has covered one team for so long, because you see a lot of characters come through an organization like that over the decades. And not only that, but for media nerds like me, the media landscape obviously has changed over the last few decades with the importance of social media and the decline of television overall. And we get into this, a very hot topic, if you follow broadcasting, in particular television these days, the idea of people who are fact-based journalists versus the loud yard barker, shouter, opine bloviators who are now dominating in the salary department. So we talk about that. What's it like, for people who are coming out of journalism school now and are faced with this challenge? Should I be a beat writer somewhere? Or should I aim to be a beat writer somewhere and maybe make scratch for a living? Or should I really try to yell as loud as possible and get my opinions out there and possibly make millions? Fascinating era of broadcasting. Something I along with my girlfriend, I had a chance to see Ricky Gervais, a Q&A with Ricky Gervais the other day. And he made a fantastic point about this very topic. Not necessarily as it pertains to the opinion shouters on television, but just the culture of the era that we live in. He said, people truly believe today, and this is Ricky Gervais's words, I'm paraphrasing here, but he said, people truly believe today that their opinion is just as valid as your fact. And I thought it hit the nail on the head. What a great way to sum up the landscape today and how news is passed on to people. That's a whole topic in itself. Maybe I'll find a expert on media and just the changing landscape and bring them on the show. If you guys have any suggestions on guests or any comments about the podcast, feel free to leave them at Arda Ocal TV on Twitter. And you can follow Rick on Twitter as well, at Rick Carpiniello. And let's get to that interview right now. It was a very fun one, and we talked about a lot of topics, including he was invited to the 1994 Stanley Cup post-victory after party. So we definitely needed to talk about that, and we did. So here's our bonus Apod podcast with Rick Carpiniello. Enjoy. All right. Finally, we are able to bring onto the podcast Rick Carpiniello. I've been looking forward to this conversation, Rick. You've been covering the Rangers for so long, since the very beginning, right? 1928?
That was my first year. Yeah. I was 22 at the time. Yeah. 78-79 was my first season. And it was a heck of a way to start a career.
No kidding.
Yeah. So they went they went to the Stanley Cup final that year, and that was an interesting way to break in.
So let's talk about before getting to the Rangers, because I definitely want to talk about that first year covering them. But so you grew up locally as well? You from New York?
Yeah, I grew up in Westchester, Harrison, New York. Spent my whole first 30 some odd years there, and I went to work at the Journal News, which was then the Westchester Rockland newspapers, in 1976. So pretty much 40 years in the business.
Wow.
Yeah, and all up in Westchester. Yeah.
Did you grow up a Rangers fan?
I did as a kid. I rooted for the Rangers when I was a kid because it was so awesome that, first of all, I loved the game, and it was so awesome watching those Channel 9 games with Jim Gordon and Big Whistle Chadwick. But, I never really got that into it. I enjoyed watching the games, and I used to go to a lot of games. But I kind of lost interest in my teen years, and then I came back to it as a professional.
So when did you realize that being in media and being a journalist was for you?
It's funny. I never actually did. I never thought that was where I was going. I took some journalism courses in college at Iona, and I was actually working in a mailroom and going to school at night when I got the call to cover some high school football games for like $15 on Saturdays. And that was 76, and that's really when I got into it. And I took an immediate liking to it, other than the fact that I couldn't type, which was a big problem. And then I became pretty good at it, I guess, because they hired me right away, and that's when I realized that this was where I wanted to be.
I'm sure a lot of people who are aspiring journalists or broadcasters listening to this would love to know what it was like getting your first job in that era. Comparing it to today, what was it like trying to land your first gig?
Well, like I said, I got very, very lucky in that somebody I knew at the paper told me that they were looking for kids to cover high school football games. And so that was a huge break for me. I couldn't imagine getting into it another way because it was so competitive. You only had so many newspapers, and you had, thousands and thousands of kids trying to get into the field. And I can't even imagine what it's like today because, newspapers are going down, are on the downturn so badly. There's so few jobs, and most newspapers are going the other direction and laying off rather than hiring. So for me, at that time, there were a lot more jobs than there are now. But even then, it was pretty rare.
So the first job was covering high school sports. What was the publication?
It was called the Westchester Rockland newspapers. We had 9 local newspapers throughout Westchester, Putnam, and Rockland counties, and I was at the Reporter-Dispatch, which was the biggest one in Westchester, and but we were all interrelated, and then eventually that they all merged into one under the umbrella name of the Journal News.
So how long did you do the high school football, and when did you start doing other sports?
Well, here's another lucky break for me, Arda, and I hope I'm not boring you with these, but before USA Today came out, we were the Gannett umbrella, and we were a prototype for USA Today. They started to, with a peach-colored newspaper, do early stories. Our papers were afternoon papers, and we decided to come out with this peach thing in the morning. That was the predecessor to USA Today. And so they needed people to do early stories in addition, and different stories than the ones that were going into our newspapers. So all of us young guys who were covering local sports got a chance to go to professional games and write very basic stories. And that's how I got started in 78, 79, just doing the early stories for that morning newspaper.
Okay, so you start covering the Rangers in 78, 79. We joked earlier, but it really was, what a year to start covering the team. They make this amazing Stanley Cup Finals run that year. And just tell me about covering that team, being a young journalist. You're with the team. You're covering these dynamic players. It's a different era in hockey. Just tell us about that season.
Well, it's completely different relationship between the media and and the players now as opposed to back then. But back then, that team especially was just loaded with characters. I mean, just great guys, funny guys, storytellers, guys who enjoyed life. John Davidson, Dave Maloney, Phil Esposito, Ron Duguay, Don Maloney. It went on, and they were just such characters. They never seemed to care about the pressure that they were under when they were playing, especially when they got into the playoffs. They just seemed to have fun with it and go with it. And that was a really special group of people. Not in the best condition all the time, not too concerned with curfew most of the time. They were a completely different group. Those guys used to bum cigarettes off me in the locker room.
Really?
Yeah, absolutely. They would go in after a game, and they'd sit in their uniforms for an hour in the locker room, and they'd smoke cigarettes and drink beers and tell stories and make fun of each other. And they weren't in the greatest shape. Like I said, they were guys that were, they were on the borderline of being out of shape, a lot of them. But they were really good players, really smart hockey guys, and really just a fun group to be around.
So, talk about their relationship with the media, and more specifically you. Like, you're this young reporter starting to cover the team. These are these dynamic characters. So, were they welcoming of you? Were you immediately, part of the family, or what was that like?
Yeah, and like I said, it was different back then. But that was an exceptional group of guys. I mean, they were so media friendly. They didn't really treat you like an intruder. You were allowed to sit there in the locker room with them for as long as you want after a game. You were allowed to talk to them before practice and after practice. And guys like Dave Maloney and John Davidson were just so terrific to be around. They would tell stories. They would tell hockey stories. They would tell non-hockey stories. I wish I could remember some of the non-hockey stories because they'd be pretty sensational right about now. But and I was young, and most of those guys were in their 20s. So I think that was an advantage for me at that time to be, a peer almost. Don Maloney was the first professional athlete I ever interviewed, and we were about the same age, about 20, 21. And it was just a fun time in my career.
The story that whenever I do alumni events with Dukes, he always tells the stories of Nick Fotiu and how he would always prank the other guys in the locker room. Like, he was the biggest prankster. It's right. Like, that's the immediate answer, is like, who's the biggest jokester in the locker room? He doesn't even have to think about it. Nick Fotiu is the answer. Right.
He's famous for filling guys' shoes with shaving cream or nailing shoes to the floor, things of that nature. Yeah, mostly good-natured. Sometimes it was the Ben Gay in the jockstrap, which wasn't as nice, I guess. When you had that prank pulled on you, it wasn't good. They used to also do some, back in the old days, some initiating, which included some forced shaving, if you know what I mean.
They talked about that too. It was like, if you don't fall asleep on a flight.
Right, exactly. Anything could happen. And if you did fall asleep, you knew when you woke up, you better look around before you did anything, because something probably happened. They were famous for opening a magazine, maybe and a little bit explicit magazine, to a certain page and leaving it on your lap while you were sleeping. And so that's the kind of things they did. I didn't travel on the plane with them very often, but these were the stories you heard, and especially the locker room antics. They were always messing up each other's clothes. They'd take somebody would come in with a real fancy new shirt, and by the time practice was over, that shirt would be in shreds in the locker. They were a little bit cold, but it was all good natured.
So I want to expand on the little bit cold part, because you know how it is today. Like, so many hockey players give those canned hockey responses. It's to the point where people can recite a typical hockey player response. Oh, I gave it 110%, dug in the corners, like that kind of thing. Right. What were the responses like after games, or even were there even intermission games at that time? Like, what were the responses like when you were asking hockey-related questions to players in that era?
Yeah, they were a little more open. they would talk about the other team. They would mock the other team to a degree where that would never do today. Today they just say, "Oh, that's a great team over there, and they play really hard." But in these days, when in those days when you talk about the opponent, there wasn't that level of respect. They would talk about some of the dirty stuff that went on in a game, or what they really thought of a player if he wasn't a stand-up guy. They'd call guys spot pickers, for example. The tough guys would call each other spot pickers, where, in other words, he won't fight the tough guys. He'll fight guys that he picks. And that's not a compliment. So they were more honest back then.
What do you think that if social media was around back then, the landscape would be much different?
Oh, my God. Those guys would have been in so much trouble.
Probably, right?
Can you imagine? Because, they were always seen out. They were always seen in New York, around New York City, in pubs in Westchester. And, there's always stories that you hear, this guy was such and such place and he was in such and such condition, or, he had to be carried to a cab, things like that were common back then in terms of the stories, because the stories never went any farther than word of mouth nearby. But if there was Twitter back then, oh my God, those guys would have been in trouble. They would have been in so much trouble. The owners would have just gone nuts with that team. And that, well, despite the fun that those guys had, the Rangers were a pretty buttoned down organization from the top. And I think it would have really been a problem for us.
What throughout your decades covering the Rangers, were there one or two? I guess that team might, as a collective, might be a good answer. But was there one or two players, either from that team or any team, that really embraced playing in New York? Whether it's the Rangers uniform, playing at MSG, or even just embracing being an athlete in New York?
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear to me, and everything always goes back to 1994 with this team, and you almost hate to always go back there, but that team especially did embrace playing in New York. Not a lot of them lived in the city at the time. Messier did, Richter, Leach, Nick Kyprios later on, a few others. Most of the guys lived in Westchester, in the suburbs, near the practice rink, which was at Playland at the time in Rye. But that team embraced winning in New York and what it would be like. Mike Keenan came in and immediately had the MSG network put together this video of ticker tape parades in New York City, and this is what it would be like if we ever won in New York. They really did grab hold of that, and then when they won, they shared the cup with New York City. Pretty much everybody in 9 million people pretty much touched the Stanley Cup that year. Messier held it over the glass so people could touch it. At the party afterwards, which I was fortunate enough to find at the auction house uptown, they took the cup outside. Estetikinen took the cup outside and passed it around the crowd outside the street. And we're talking about thousands of people out in that street. And it went around and around, and it came back. And they shared the cup with the city, and that team especially really knew what New York City was all about and embraced it.
How do the athletes in different sports compare to athletes in hockey as it pertains to getting quotes and interviews? Yeah,
they're hockey players have always been the best in my opinion, and in the opinions of a lot of people. But that's not to say there aren't great guys in other sports. Guys like Curtis Granderson on the Mets, he's just a wonderful guy. Justin Tuck on the Giants. There are always great people in other sports. There just seem to be more of them in hockey, and they're just more down to earth. Now, I think that's changed a little bit in recent years perhaps because the money has gotten so big. The hockey players used to be way down the ladder, and they're not anymore. They're pretty well compensated, and so I think that the overall personality in the game has changed a little bit to the negative, but I still think by and large they're the best people to deal with.
So let's go back to your career. So you 39 years with the Rangers, a couple blips on the road. Then all of a sudden, in the last year, you get let go. And that, to me, we all know the media landscape is changing. This is obvious. But, from your journey and what you saw, when did it really sink into you and you started to realize, wow, this job that I'm doing right now may not be something that I could completely retire on?
Well, I saw a lot of friends and colleagues lose their jobs over the years, especially recent years, and I didn't figure I'd make it to retirement age. I didn't count on being laid off when I was, but we all have to go sometime. Also, that the job had changed, Arda. When I was starting, and even probably for the first 20 years, it was just the newspaper. So all you had to worry about was your story for the newspaper. You could go, you'd be on a road trip in Edmonton or something, and you go to practice in the morning, and you don't have to write anything right away. After practice, you don't have to write not doing anything during practice except watching practice and talking to people. And you'd go have lunch and take a nap and then go to the game and write an early story, and then the game's over and you write another story and you're out. And that was it. There was nothing else to do. But when I finished my career, I was getting up first thing in the morning and blogging, and then I was doing a pregame video at the arena, and then I was doing pregame blog posts, audio. I was doing the game. I was tweeting throughout the game. I was on Facebook, all this stuff. I was even on Snapchat at the end. And then, after the game, you do another video. You do blog posts. You, of course, have to do your game story still. And what used to be a really pleasant job became a 16-hour day very quickly. And so I'm not sure that I could have done a lot more years of 16 hours a day, but still I would have been happy to do that job for a long time.
Rick, I could just imagine you on Snapchat doing a face swap with Henrik Lundqvist or something like that.
I couldn't believe I was even saying Snapchat when I was doing it. I have a bunch of nephews and nieces, and their faces were buried in their phones all the time doing that stuff. And I'm like, what are you guys doing? They're like, Snapchat. I'm like, what the heck is that? And I was probably the oldest person on Snapchat at the time.
I loved, I have to say, I loved, especially after the games, I was always amazed by how many, because you'd always have 24 things or 26 things after games, and you'd put them all in one article. And I always marveled at that. Man, some people would just take the game and do a recap, but here you are writing sometimes 30 different points from the game, and they're all different points. And I always, how long did it take to get to a point like that where you could look at a game and say, oh, here's a little thing here, here's a little thing there, there's a little thing there. That's impressive to me. It's amazing.
Yeah, well, I learned to do it during, as it was happening. Something happens, type it right away, get it in a file right away, because you'd never remember all that stuff. But it was a lot of work. Every single night, every single home game, I would be literally the last person out of the press room at the Garden. And I have to make the last train home. I would type all the way home on the train, and I would get home, and I would still do another hour to an hour and a half work after the game. I'd be getting to bed at 4 o'clock in the morning on a game day. It was a lot of work, but that was my favorite thing to do. The game reviews were really popular, and I could pretty much go off the tracks and be sarcastic, and I could make fun of people, and I could do pretty much anything I wanted to do during those reviews. And the work that I put into it was tremendous, but it was so worth it. It was so rewarding, especially the next day when people would get up in the morning with their coffee and go right onto my blog and read my stuff. It's so rewarding, and of course, the comment section steals the show every day. The guys who comment are absolutely nuts. Tremendous Ranger fans, but just absolutely nuts. And I really had so much fun with that. I was wishing at times that I could just do that, not work for the newspaper, just do that blog, just do those game reviews, because that was so much fun. And it gave me so much freedom and so much reward.
So as somebody who's been in the media industry for several decades, one of the big, hot topics in terms of the landscape of media is this whole notion of the factual journalist versus the loud opinionator. This is, the paradigm is sort of shifting in the landscape of media, and I'd love to get your comments on that because you've been covering sports for so long, and it seems like all the big money these days is going to people who are shouting their opinions on TV as opposed to providing neutral facts online.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I guess that's the way society is going because those guys are making a ton of money. The loudmouths are making a ton of money. And, you see how celebrity-driven our world is and how they want to see reality. They want to see people screaming at each other. They want to see LeVar Ball. It's sad, actually, but I kind of like to be in the middle of that. You want to have some fun. You want to have an opinion. You want to have some sarcasm and some mockery and things in your work. But you also want to be a journalist. You don't want to just be a shouter and a carnival barker like some of these guys are. But the carnival barkers make a lot more money than the journalists. They make a lot more money than the journalists.
Well, it seems like that vertical is growing. Where it's but the thing is that the carnival barkers, using your words there, like they wouldn't be able to opine without the facts. So but isn't the landscape a little bit skewed right now? Like, shouldn't the people assembling the facts be why are they being compensated so much less? Because those facts are what are being used to create the big spectacle.
Yeah, you're making way too much sense, though.
Don't let logic get in the way of a good story, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, if I write something that such and such player does this or doesn't deserve this or whatever, that's one thing, and I'll probably hear about it. But if so-and-so on ESPN or Fox is across the table from somebody else who doesn't even know this player, barks it loud enough, then that gets way more attention than I do. You have to have some facts. You certainly do. But your opinion and how loudly you can bark it seems to be more important.
And so somebody who's been in this industry for so long, what's your opinion on this? And how will you move forward? Does that mean that you then change the way that you present things? Like how does this affect you, and how do you feel about all this?
Well, if I could find somebody who's going to pay me $1 million a year to do that, then I'm doing that.
Fair enough.
I mean, I don't. These guys who've gotten those jobs. In those positions, sure, I'm jealous and envious of them, but they were smart enough to do it, so all credit to them. I don't see myself ever doing that, but like I said, if I ever had an opportunity to do it, I imagine I would start barking.
So let's end on this. So after 39 years, you've done pretty much as there is to do in the media landscape. Is there anything that you haven't done yet that you want to do?
I want to see Augusta National. I'm a big golf guy. Love watching golf. So I want to see Augusta National. I've never done an Olympics, but I'm not sure that they're so spread out that I'm not sure that I really want to do that. But other than that, I've pretty much done everything else. I mean, I've done World Series. I did some crazy World Series. The 86 Mets was just, as you know, one of the nuttier playoff runs in history. So I've done those things. I've seen the U.S. Olympic team, and I've gotten to know those guys, a lot of them, in 1980. I've accomplished and done a lot, seen a lot, and I have zero complaints, zero regrets. But, yeah, I'd like to see Augusta National. There's probably a few other things I'd like to do once or twice.
Awesome, Rick. Really appreciate your time here, and I think a lot of people either learned something or were definitely entertained by the stories, especially the post Stanley Cup party, which I love that you were at. Do you have a picture of you holding the Stanley Cup above your head? And if so, where can we tweet this?
I have a picture of me standing with the Stanley Cup on the ice, but the cup is down. I'm not holding it up.
Okay.
But I can probably send you that.
That'll be the header for this podcast.
But listen, I've got a ton more stories if you ever want to do this again. We can talk about players and individuals and teams. I'd love to do this again.
Yeah, phenomenal. Before we let you go, where can people find you, speaking of Twitter and other social media?
Well, I'm at Rick Carpiniello, Rick Carpiniello on Twitter, and I'm currently providing stories for msgnetworks.com, and I'm doing that through the summer, and then we'll see where it goes from there.
Rick, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Arda. It's a pleasure.
So there it is, our conversation with Rick Carpiniello. Thank you very much to Rick for joining us here on the Apod on a bonus edition. That's right, we went above and beyond this week to bring you another episode. We will be back next Wednesday. In the meantime and in between time, feel free to check out our last Wednesday's episode as well with Alyssa Rose, the daughter of famous New York broadcaster Howie Rose, and a budding broadcaster herself. So definitely check out that podcast. She's had quite the interesting life as well. We talked to her in a blog post on msgnetworks.com about her father's famous Matto call and how it's survived through the decades and how it's still a thing in 2017. So definitely check all of that out. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll be back next Wednesday with another edition of the Apod. Have a great weekend, y'all.